This is Jean Marie Evans with KGNU, Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins. I'm in Boulder, Colorado at the Force from Home exhibit, a free interactive exhibit put on by Doctors Without Borders, designed to expose the realities of the global refugee crisis. Sitting down with me now is Doctors Without Borders surgeon and board of directors member, Dr. Africa Stewart. Thank you so much for joining me today. First of all, how have your experiences with Doctors Without Borders been so far?
It's been a whirlwind. It's been a little bit of learning new things and learning how to do what I was trained to do in a different way and learning how to do it in resource-poor areas. And that has been the best part, sort of realizing that the thing that I'm good at is the one thing that people need. So I'm able to go to the middle of nowhere and do what I'm good at and make an impact and be able to do a small change. And that's hospitals, women and children. So we're delivering babies safely. We are getting women out of harm's way. And we're preserving families in the best way that we can. So we're doing malnutrition and we're doing a lot of education. And a lot of that has to do with how we're organized. And that part of it, that part of being a doctor without border is wonderful, for the most part. It's scary and it's wonderful. And I love it. I'm one of those crazy field workers now that I never thought I would be. I always imagined myself as, I don't know, a white jacket, part of the community, and my jacket is never white, and I don't speak the language, but I know what happens when I don't go. I know that people bleed to death because they don't have good surgeons within 800, 1,200 miles. So it's worth it from that standpoint because I can see the impact. I can appreciate what I'm good at is needed here.
And so you've been a member since 2011, or you've been active with Doctors Without Borders since 2011. So what made you decide to do this? I mean, you said you imagine yourself kind of more like in the clean white jacket, and that is not the case anymore. So what was that transition like for you?
The transition was quick. It was, I applied. And I was just thinking I might be able to do this, trying to figure out childcare and the logistics of being away. And just after I'd sort of decided in my mind that I was going to go to the info days and do the orientation for Doctors Without Borders, they called and said, "We need you to go to Sudan. Are you available?" And I was terrified and entirely unprepared. So I texted my husband and I said, "MSF called. Can I go to Sudan?" And he texts back, "Autocorrect is crazy. What'd you say?" And I'm like, "No, that was what I was trying to say. I want to go to Sudan." That was Friday. And I left on Thursday. So 6 days later, I was on a plane. I had never been across the Atlantic Ocean. I had never been anywhere except vacation. And it was right there. Like all of a sudden, I'm going. I didn't know where it was on the map. I wasn't sure if I could pick out Sudan if it wasn't labeled. I wasn't sure where I was going. But I read the reports of the person who was leaving, sort of who I would be replacing. And that person was a general surgeon, not an obstetrician, not a gynecologist. Sort of that piece of their skill set was missing. And the context had changed. We thought there was going to be a lot of violence and there was going to be a lot of trauma. But instead, it was women and children that were being forced to leave where they were to go somewhere else. And that's what the help was needed. So I went and I was on the ground 15 minutes before I saw the first patient and we were off to the races. And it was a whole lot of things I had never seen nor heard of all of a sudden. So it was a quick transition. I sort of made up in my mind that I was going to do it. My husband was on board. And my family was very, very supportive. So they came and helped him with the kids. My littlest one was not quite 2. She was little. I wasn't sure she would remember me. I don't understand how children's memories work. I'm not sure she'd know who I was when I got back. And my oldest was 14. Was Gabby? Yeah. So she was 14. My son was 4. So we had a house full of kids. And I made a bunch of spaghetti sauce. I ordered some of those meals that come freeze-dried and put them in the freezer and labeled them, and I had dates, and it was just a matter of remembering to take something out the night before so it would be defrosted, and they made it work. And I thought I would maybe be one of those one mission persons, just do it. They needed help and I helped. But it calls. There's always a need. And unfortunately, my line of work, there aren't a lot of us that can do this kind of work away from home for long periods of time. And since I had figured out how to make it work, I kept doing it. And now this is what I do. Like, the kids think of this as what I do. My oldest is old enough to remember when I was in private practice, and she remembers I was miserable. I didn't feel like what I was supposed to be doing, and this very much does. So it was a quick transition, and then I turned into one of these crazy people that loves the field. I mean, I always say I'm not going back, because sometimes it's a lot. And it's just a lot, and you can't go home and decompress with people who have no idea what you're talking about. But every time I say I don't go back, I was wrong. I do go back, and I love it. I love being able to be a help, even though my skill set is small. It's nice. I enjoy it.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your specialty and why that's important in the region that you work?
For the most part, obstetrics, gynecology in the field falls on two lines. So there's pregnancy and, safe deliveries, be that vaginally or abdominally. That part of it is always a need. There's this other piece of it that has to do with gender-related violence and fistulas, so the specifics of surgical care in the field. Unfortunately, rape and torture are always going to be tools of war, and we need places where we can make people whole again. So surgically, that part is easy. Wash my hands, put things back together. But the other part is being in a safe place, being able to sleep at night. And our hospitals provide the surgical care and the medical care and the medicines, but we also have borders that are culturally honored. So we treat both sides of conflicts. Everybody knows that if you leave your weapons at the door, you can be treated. So it creates a safe space within our hospitals that is valuable to people who have been through the worst of the worst. And a lot of them are doing it thousands and thousands of miles from home. And there's shame that comes with it, and there's the fear, and there's just the anxiety of having lived through some of these situations. So what I do in the field tends to be surgical, and it never stops. There are days that I wash my hands, do a case, wash my hands, use the bathroom, wash my hands, do a case. And I keep doing it all day until I realize that I'm hungry, that I'm getting grumpy. I take a break. And it's isolating a little bit because I can get stuck in my world, sort of forget that this woman walked for 3 months to get here. And what happened along the way is hard for her to talk about. So we deal with their injuries and the infections and all of those things. And unwanted pregnancies. It's something to be said for carrying your enemy's baby. But we learn from our patients. We try to make it a point not to go to a place to distribute what we have, but to go to a place and figure out what they need and then make that available. And it's subtle, but it makes all the difference in terms of mental health. It makes all the difference in terms of being able to anticipate and react to what's happening in the field.
So in addition to being a surgeon and on the board of the directors, you're also a guide at this exhibit. So I'm going to have you take us through the exhibit a little bit. So we start off in the like a 360-degree film area where it kind of touches upon the 5 countries that are represented here. And then we go into the next station where we talk about push factors. And at this, it's very interesting at this, we have 30 seconds to grab 5 items, and that 30 seconds is going by real quick. And I grabbed passport, money, shoes, medicine, and a phone. And I thought I was being really smart with all my decisions. I was like, I picked the best 5 ones. But it ended up not being necessarily true. Maybe my passport isn't necessarily valid, or the currency exchange if I'm leaving the country Can you just kind of explain a little bit about why this is an important station and kind of maybe some of the misconceptions about push factors and what people have to take with them when they do have to leave home?
I think you're right. We start in the dome, which is the end of the story. So we start with this video presentation of where people will end up, where are they going? And then we double back and say, okay, what made you leave and how did you get here? So a good story begins with the ending, right? And then we start with, especially now that you've seen in this video where people are going and where they end up, why would you leave your home? Like, what are the things that make you leave your home? And they vary. There's natural disasters and environmental disasters. So if you live in an industrial country, you have a scheduled C-section on September the 5th when you're just due. You get your little bag packed and you're ready for your C-section. And the night before, the hospital that you were supposed to go to, slides down a mountain. There's a mudslide or a raging river. Something happened. And that kind of context where we come in and we are doing what the staff in hospital would have done if they were here. And that's one of our strong points. And it's one of the things we do well is sort of figure out how to do things when there isn't any electricity or we're not sure where the water lines are coming from. Those push factors can also be war, long-standing new wars. It matters for farmers in these smaller countries where people are doing subsistence farming and they have for generations on the same land. But when there's fighting outside, there's bombs outside, farmers aren't putting their crops in the ground. So in a couple of months, there won't be enough food around here. So that's a push factor. Sometimes it's not the war itself, but the things that happen after the war begins. And there's just a natural fleeing from violence. One of the guys in the video says, I ran because I was being chased. The question that was asked, it's not on the camera, is, why did you leave? And his answer was, I ran because I was being chased. Not even sure who they were, what they were going to do, but men in machetes, I grabbed what I could and I left. I came alone. I'm not sure where my family is. So those kinds of factors tell the story from the beginning, sort of what made us leave our homes, because it also steers what we brought with us, what was available to us to leave. So some of the smaller countries, you have to pretend that you're not leaving because you don't want the rebels to find out that you're on the road. So we have patients who will tell us what they hid in the folds of their garments to look like they were just going to market. And we also have people who say, I left currency, but I brought jewelry because I was hoping maybe gold or diamonds or these jewels would be barterable. But our currency is essentially lighter fluid now because it doesn't mean anything. Our government doesn't exist anymore. What do you do with your money? So those factors, all different, all kind of the same, they lead us to the same place. It leaves you to leave your home quickly, and you have to decide what you can take. Can you look like you're leaving? So if you put everything on the back of your motorcycle, if you pile up your children in their things and look like you're leaving, you make yourself vulnerable in a different way. And for the patients who are coming in that South American, Central American route, sort of coming through the desert, all the extortion and the bandits along the way, they tell a slightly different story of pretending to be someone else, learning another accent, that subtlety of language, hoping you can blend in for a little while so you can get to the next place. So we talk about how families, individuals get smarter and quieter because it affects children. It affects when they get to the camp. We have children who have been taught to be so quiet that they don't have the beginnings of language. They haven't done that little thing that toddlers do when they babble at you and you have no idea what they're saying, but they're looking right at you. It feels like they're speaking. They don't do that. They've lost it altogether. And it's one of those things that's supposed to happen when you're 6 to 18 months old. But if you're constantly being quieted, if you're not used to being touched by other people, those are the kinds of issues that you see later on along the route. So from country to country, the push factors are slightly different. But if you can imagine, they all sort of pushing you away from your home, from what you know. And if you're from a place like South Sudan where they don't celebrate birthdays, it's just not a thing. Nobody knows when their birthday is. But that also means you don't have any papers. You don't have a date of birth. You get to a camp and someone's shouting at you, what's your name, what's your date of birth, what is your... Culturally speaking, they have absolutely no idea. People will tell me when I meet them in labor and delivery, if I say, how old is this patient? They'll say, oh, my oldest has become a woman and my youngest is weaned. So that means I have a daughter who has her first period and I have a child who just got off a breast. So you can sort of do the math. People get pregnant every 1.5 to 2 years and you figure she's almost 40. And that's the reality of being forced, of never leaving your village, of asking a child from a small village, where are you from? They'll say, I'm from my village. I'm from home. Well, what are your parents' names? What's your mother's name? You're trying to figure out where you belong, where you came from. And most little kids will tell you, my mom's name is Mommy. That's what I call her. They don't know any different. And it takes a while to get your mother's accent. So we can't always tell where children are from when they arrive alone, because they don't know. And it takes that subtle difference between Boston and New York is obvious if you're from Philly. But if you're from the Midwest, it all kinds of sounds like Northeast. It's hard to tell, especially with children. It's not until they're about 5 or 6 that they really sound like they're from the South or they're from Boston. So we have all these things in place to figure out how to tell where you're from, because a lot of this happens in the middle of the night. They say, we heard them coming and we ran. And those are the first 2 stations, because it really gives the visitors who are coming a sense of the individual stories. That nobody left because they wanted to come and take your job. They left because someone was chasing them. And that's the beginning of a lot of people's story along the route.
So that is kind of the story of how people are forced. And then the next station is more about the journey. And there's a raft there, and there's these life jackets. And this was really quite fascinating because there's a raft, and the lady taking me through the tour said that the boat was for 8 people, and normally it's more like 30 to 40 people fitting in a boat. There's no GPS, there's no sanitation, there's kind of these fake life jackets, and I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that, but also, and that's kind of what we actually have seen that in the West through media, people going through the Mediterranean. But I'm also curious as to what that journey is like where you have worked, South Sudan, and Nigeria.
So for the most part, Central Africa, a lot of this journey is going to be by footing. So it's on foot. So we're talking thousands of miles getting from one place to another. So in my line of work, I have about 40 weeks for people to get from one place to another, for you to have this baby safely. So we have, on average, 1,600 miles from Burundi or South Sudan into Europe, just to breach that line. And that takes seasons. So you have to be somewhere from spring to possibly the following winter, depending on how long it takes you to get there. Because you have small children, you may or may not have your parents with you as well. So getting from one place to another by foot takes months and months. So we change how we do things from a humanitarian standpoint. We give patients their charts because we're not sure where or when they will have good care somewhere else, but we know that they'll be on the move. So we put their charts in a Ziploc bag. It's in English, French, and Arabic. And we say, the next time you get to somewhere, give this to the first person you see this logo. They'll know what to do. So it changes and informs how we give care. It also changes and informs how we go about setting up these different camps. Where are we going to be? What do we offer? What is needed? Because the needs of a population that is stable physically is a lot different. Because you're out in the bush, you're out in the elements, potentially for months. So those small scrapes and scratches that you get when you cut through somewhere, you're just cutting through the bushes just to save some time. But then if later there's a dirty river and something gets in those wounds, so we're dealing with those kinds of injuries. And even on the Mediterranean, that journey has been a learning experience for us. We have patients that are in the water with this layer of gasoline that's been floating on the water with them. And when it mixes with salt, it gives these horrible burns. So we have to deal with the folks who didn't drown that are all covered in burns. So along the journey, sort of as it relates to on the move, we have to change how we do things. We notice how families arrive in gender blocks because the boys went one way to scout it out, and then they sent their wives and daughters another way to make sure they weren't caught by smugglers or extortioners. So we notice those sort of patterns amongst people who are on the move, and then we're able to change how we go about administering care. And sometimes that is as simple as finding someone who speaks their language so that they can charge a phone. And say, my family is hiding in the bush. We each have 1 minute of airtime and have just long enough to tell them which way to go. So we're changing how we do things. We're adapting to the situation, and it varies depending on rainy season and the weather and what's happening conflict-wise.
So from there, we get taken to a few different stations that talk about the camp specifically. One of the stations we talk about basic needs, food, shelter, water, and water being a huge theme for many reasons. It's a huge theme for the rest of the stations, including the medical concerns. But I wanted to kind of touch upon the connectivity piece, because when we were going through the tour, when we learn about basic needs, we don't always think about connectivity, but our world is changing. And can you talk a little bit about connectivity and why that is considered a basic need?
This is, again, that education that happens in the field. So we've learned what people are willing to barter for. So food and water, supplies. But what has happened over time is people will barter for airtime minutes or for a charger. Mind you, our camps are filled with people who had real jobs. So electricians and engineers who are able to rig up things so that you can charge a phone. And it's also a matter of where you are in the world, the kind of plug that you have. So is the European 2-prong, the African 3, the American 2 or the American 3, there's the French kind, there's all kinds of, so we have to figure out what kind of phone do you have, how to charge it. But it becomes a basic need when our patients are willing to give up their food and their water to use the phone. And that part of it, sort of running a camp and keeping people safe, is shining a light on what people need. Because if we ignore it and say, it's not the same as water, it's not the same as food, we're MSF, we don't have to deal with that. But then it goes underground, and the world of bartering can get ugly. So we just shine a light on it. Put it right there in the market and say, you can get, a tomato and an onion, or you can charge your phone. Or what happens more often is that people will barter time. So I can watch the kids or do some laundry in exchange for airtime minutes, or in exchange for being able to charge my phone. Because along the way, you can't keep contacts in your phone. You can't give your enemies access to your friends and families list, because they will extort them. They will do the things they need to do in order to get from you what they need. So you have to have all of those numbers committed to memory and a system to coordinate. And technology has changed. The last time we had a global refugee crisis was World War II. Everyone in Europe was displaced and things had been bombed. So the rules and the customs that we had in place no longer apply. So we have networks of, I hear there were smugglers here, or the rebels have closed off this road, and people are able to adapt and adjust. But having access to it, and to a certain extent having the hope of hearing your mom's voice again. It does a lot for patients who are in this situation. They know that if they can work hard enough to get a few minutes, the number that their mother taught them as a song, even if it was years ago, most people who have lived this life, who have journeyed from one place to another, they remember the song their mom taught them. Call this number and let me know you're safe. And that is how families are torn apart and drawn together during all this crisis. It's part of the journey, and we're learning. We're learning how important it is to families to stay in touch, and we honor it as best we can.
Next, we go to the camps itself, and we talk about we go to stations where there are the medical concerns, and also the tents themselves, which you kind of go there. There's one tent that you can tell is a makeshift tent made from tarp and other materials. And there's a tent that looks like, coming from Colorado, it's like, that's a nice tent. That looks like it's from REI, or like, that's a spacious tent. And then our tour guide tells us there's 6 people in this small tent. There might be 50 people in this tent. And then she points to the bigger tents where the virtual reality is and saying they pushed 2 of those together with 300 people. And what kind of issues come out of living in situations where it's kind of that cramped and, struggling to get resources as refugee camps kind of have to deal with all the time?
There are a lot of formulas in terms of how many latrines you need, how much water do you need based on how many people you have. And that part of it is way outside of my expertise. So we have water and sanitation that know, from day to day, how many people do we have, because we need to either dig more latrines or we need to increase our water supply. But it's also a matter of dealing with the elements. So some of those makeshift tents are that way because they have to be moved based on the rainy season. So you can't be in one place for any long time because the weather is going to change in a way that is impactful. So you'll see some of the tarps and bags of rice and burlap for warmth that are on a makeshift pole, but that can be picked up, folded up, and moved to higher ground as rainy season comes. There are others that are, like you said, looks like it's straight out of REI, because there are plenty of other NGOs that will provide tents or blankets. But what people don't realize when they come to an exhibit like this is that this is going to be shared by a lot of people. This is a family tent that's going to be cut in half. There may be 2 families in here. Or in camps that have small children, we were talking about those language loss and the social networks of children is just sort of vital to their development. We'll put a lot of toddlers in a tent like that and let the moms do shifts, watch the little ones. They start to play, they start to be touched again. They start making noise and being toddlers again. And it's also a piece of our mental health component because it allows the moms who have lost a child along the way or all of their children along the way to hear laughter again and hug little bodies and start their healing process as well. So these tents can be any number of things. And it's also relevant to remind ourselves that sometimes these tents have to be hospital beds because if something runs through the camp, cholera, any of these diseases that are based on proximity and low hygiene. Sometimes we have to turn the tent into a quarantine or we have to turn it into a treatment center. So the flexibility that living in tents gives is helpful for us in terms of distributing care. We're able to go tent by tent and say, okay, where are all of your children? They are all going to get checked out. We're going to make sure that each and every one of them has what they need. So it's part of living in close spaces, and it's hard. It's hard to honor cultural traditions. We have certainly families that would never, ever share space with someone else's husband during their period or while they're nursing. And we try to honor those traditions. So we'll see in these bigger tents, there'll be a bunch of nursing moms and infants, and they have each other for guidance and support. And also it helps to honor those traditions so that they're not doing things in a camp that they would never do at home. We don't want to ask people to abandon everything they know, even in these most dire of circumstances. And it also informs how we deliver our care.
And after that, there is a virtual reality piece, which is very, very interesting and very, very cool. But this is kind of all the time we have today. Thank you so much for sitting down and talking with me today. Once again, this is Jeannie Evans for KGNU, Boulder, Denver, and Fort Collins. If you'd like to check out this exhibit, it's downtown Boulder, Pearl and 13th Street, or you can check out their website, www.forcefromhome.com, and they will be here until the 10th.